Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're tuning into, and welcome to Understanding the Ocean, all about wind with Laura Zulliger. My name is Melissa DeMarie, and I will be your host for today and every. I'm the founder of California Water Sport Collective, or Cali Collective for short. For those of you that don't know, but we have so many regulars here, this is pretty awesome. Cali Collective is a community building organization where we use kayaking and other paddle sports as our medium to get people together, get them connected, get out on the water, build some skills, build some confidence, and pretty much just have a great time. Anyways, I am super stoked to have Laura back on our series. Laura is our saltwater program director, and I honestly don't know where in the world I would be without Laura. She is a master of everything she does, whether it's sea kayaking, whitewater, surf, tech, accounting. Anytime I have questions, Laura is the person that I call. So thank you, Laura, for not only just being amazing on the water, but also behind the scenes. I don't know what the heck I would do without you. But anyways, I'm going to stop talking for now, and I'm going to hand the mic over to Laura. Oh, and then a couple of quick things. We are going to be keeping everyone on mute during the duration of Laura's presentation, and then once we start our Q&A, we'll let you guys talk and ask lots of questions. So I would highly encourage you, while Laura is speaking, while she's doing her lecture, to go ahead and put your questions into the chat. And then when she wraps up and we move into our Q&A, then I'll go through our chat room, and I'll start calling to answer some questions. But anyways, without further ado, let me get Laura here, our co-host. All right. Laura, you are on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mel. That was such a generous introduction. I'm really honored to be among the Cali Collective instruction staff and team. And as Melissa mentioned, I teach both sea kayaking and whitewater, as well as surf kayaking. And I love having that cross-discipline approach and being able to teach with Cali Collective. And also, of course, provide tech help when needed. So just a quick heads up. Today, ironically, I shared this with Mel right before we got started, but it's really windy here. I'm coming to you live from the Presidio in San Francisco Bay Area. And as you can see, we're bathed with beautiful sunshine. And as you can probably hear, we're enjoying some windy conditions. And if it gets to be too much, please just chat Melissa or me and let me know. There also is ironically an interesting thing happening on the bridge right now, where it creates this loud harmonic sound bowl effect with the new guardrails they placed in. So it might sound like there's like a large Tibetan singing bowl going off in the background. So I'll rely on you to let me know if it gets a little overwhelming, but I felt I should mention that, especially given that this is about the wind. So I'm gonna go ahead and share the presentation I've created. All right. Excellent. Okay, so a few of y'all were here when I did the presentation on current and tides, and this is going to follow a similar format where I'm going to try and make sure the scope is not only balanced between theoretical as well as understanding predictions, where to find them, how to read them, but also some applied tips and tricks for paddling into the wind. So let's go over those goals real quick. I have a quick intro to what causes wind, but I'm not going to go into it too much because a lot of folks know that. But if you don't, I think it's just interesting just to think of, especially as we progress. And then we're going to go into forecasting and reading predictions, and also reading what you see, reading the water and the sea state to infer what conditions and what level of wind you're dealing with. And then we'll go into how to paddle in the wind without going crazy, because it can be infuriating. If I know a lot of you have experienced that. So real quick, what causes wind? I was going to describe this myself, but I found this video from Bill Nye the Science Guy, and it was such a great, simple 2-minute explanation that I couldn't resist. So please bear with me while we indulge in some Bill Nye.
Bill Nye, the Science Guy. Bill Nye, the Science Guy.
Wind all over the world is caused by heating and cooling of the earth. The wind can do work. Hey, look at that. And it makes sailboats go! Wow, he went right through the door. Hey! Thanks, guys. Thanks. Whew. Now, real wind doesn't come from a fan. No, in nature, wind is caused by the heat from the sun and the rotation of the earth. That's what makes these intricate patterns of clouds that we see on this photo from space. It works something like this. This is our great big plastic wind box of science. These lights represent the sun. This ice represents the north and south poles. So here's what happens. Energy from the sun heats the land, and the land warms the air over the land. The air molecules get going faster, and they spread farther apart, so they don't weigh as much for the room they take up. So cold air can push the warm air up. That's why we say warm air rises. So look what's happening. The smoke shows us that the air is sinking over the cold poles, flowing over the cities, and then rising over the warm parts. See, it goes around in a great big circle. And that's what happens on the Earth. Now, there's one more thing. The Earth is spinning, so the wind starts spinning. That's why wind comes from all different directions. Wind is wild.
Bill Nye, the Science Guy.
Awesome. All right. So, as Bill more eloquently than I probably could and with more brevity explained, here we're back into our presentation. Wind is really created fundamentally by the temperature differentials that we experience all over the world, and also that creates different levels of air pressure. So those things combined, those two factors, they're all interplaying with each other and create wind. So that is just a quick overview. And I also, I want to preface where I totally welcome questions you all have about how clouds are created, how storms are created, but please keep in mind that my knowledge is really limited on some meteorological details of that sort. But if I don't have the answer ready or handy, I would very gladly research it because I love learning more about this. So first off, where do we find marine forecasts? How do you know before you go? And what do you look for? So many of you might be familiar with NOAA Marine Zone Forecast, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Association. They provide not only land-based forecasts, but also marine zone forecasts. So for sea kayakers, we're mostly in a salty aquatic environment. You'll want to be looking ideally at the marine zone forecast, especially if you're going to be more along the open coast. But I like to also combine that with more land-based inland forecasts. So the wind is one of those elements that is incredibly hard to predict. Unlike the tides, where it's driven by the moon and there's an element of constant prediction that you can just count on. I know all of us have probably been in a myriad of situations where we thought the wind was going to be one thing, and then we got there and it was completely different. It's just very difficult to predict, and there's so many different variables in predicting it. That's why when you're looking at forecasts, I recommend not just depending on one resource or one source. And on top of that, I really encourage you, just in general, to keep a kayak log or any sort of, even if it's a mental model or just a mental catalog of the sea states and the wind and how it reacts with the topography of where you want to paddle, and just kind of keep a backlog and gain that knowledge, and not just enjoy and be out there, but also use it as an opportunity to gain information, and build your native knowledge of that place. So part of that is always knowing the forecast, and then always being able to contrast that with what you're seeing and remember it. So NOAA is the #1 resource I go to. The #2 is Windy. I really like how Windy shows you not just global patterns, but also you can zoom in to very, very local wind patterns, but it shows you how there's always this larger interplay, and a larger like macro, just for a lack of a better word, just like macro happenings at all times, whether it's like seeing a hurricane in the Gulf and how that's creating wind direction for all different aspects of the Gulf and Mexico and Florida, or if it's, observing what's happening in Southern California while there's a large storm system up in Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, and just constantly noticing any trends and having an eye for the macro happenings of the wind. Windy has an app and also a web-based version. Both are really great. Wind Guru is a check tool, and so it'll be in meters for the wave height if you're looking at wind waves that are generated by the wind. But I find that it's a really reliable international resource. So there have been times where I've been, let's say, in Asia, where there isn't readily available, like there isn't a NOAA, or if there it is, it's really hard to access that information, especially if everything's in Mandarin Chinese, so to say. So Wind Guru has pretty good collection of international data. And it also is designed for windsurfers who care most about the wind. So they make sure to have really definitive information on that one. If I'm going to the surf zone or any place where there's a beach, I consult both Surfline and Magic Seaweed as well, just to see what they're saying. Surfline for certain spots will often take into consideration the orientation of the wind combined with topographical features. And I find that, let's say you wanted to paddle around Bolinas, which is a beach here in the Bay Area with a southern exposure right by a large cliff. And we'll discuss more about a lee shore, but it's often in the lee of prevailing winds, and they take that into account when they are giving their forecast on Surfline. So, and again, just to mention inland forecasts, if you're paddling further inland, definitely consult the typical forecast and an emphasis on the wind. I like Weather Underground for that. All right. When we're looking at these forecasts, what are we looking for? So when I look, I want to ask these questions. How strong is the wind? What direction is it coming from, or directions? Because sometimes in just the span of one day, the wind can drastically change directions. So knowing approximately when and what direction is helpful. And then I also want to know, what's the exposure? What's the environment going to be like, and how's that going to mix with the forecast? Am I going to be in a constriction, like paddling under the Golden Gate Bridge, becomes this giant wind tunnel, kind of like walking downtown on a windy day where there's like wind like sweeping and gusting through the skyscrapers? Or am I going to be in a sheltered cove where there's a big ridge and a nice, beautiful, calm environment? And of course, I want to know, how is that going to change throughout the day? What is the trend in the morning, in the afternoon? What's happening on the day before, the day after? Because there could be a wind that comes earlier than predicted, or something that arrives later than predicted. So I'm looking for all of those things. Cool. And just to let you guys know, this little this forecast on the left is from Surfline for Rodeo Beach. All right, so let's take, for example, the wind forecast for Rodeo Beach, which is a beach in the Marin Headlands. It's often a great place to launch from if you want to go rock hopping or rock gardening, and even do some surfing on the Marin Headlands on the ocean side here in Northern California. So let's look and see what my favorite resources are saying. So as of yesterday, NOAA was predicting northwest winds 20 to 30 knots with gusts up to 35 knots. And those are generating wind waves 5 to 6 feet. And something to note, they're in the NOAA forecast, they're going to give you not just the wind, but oftentimes if they're wind generated waves that are generated like close to the coast, they're not coming from a storm system that was, brewing in the middle of the Pacific, and then these are swell that are now leaving its storm family and coming to our coastline. These are just the wind that are like made this morning, made today from this intense wind. So that's why they differentiate the wind waves from the swell and the swell direction that's coming in. So that's what you see with the west swell, 4 to 6 feet at 10 seconds, and southwest around 2 feet at 15 seconds. You'll notice that the wind waves that they mention, they don't give a period in the form of seconds. That's because it really is just waves that are being kicked up in the form of chop and whitecaps from the wind colliding with the ocean and the shore here. Below, you'll see Surfline, and Surfline switches from knots to miles per hour, but they give you, if there is a change or predicted change in wind direction, they have these little arrows, and you can hover over the arrows to get more specific directional information. So if you were to look at their reading, they're predicting 13 miles an hour west-northwest. So they're showing a little bit more west in the morning, and that's becoming more northwest in the afternoon as the wind intensifies throughout the afternoon. And they're saying up to 18 mile per hour gust. Something to note, a knot equals around 1.15 miles. So I like to just keep a log. I usually will try and find knots just so I can keep learning those. But it helps to know what that means in miles per hour, because I feel like as Americans, especially, we're used to understanding speed through miles per hour. And then on the right, you'll see windy, and this is pretty zoomed in. But if you were to zoom out on windy, you would see the whole Bay Area wind pattern for the day. And you can, of course, scroll forward throughout the day, or also rewind to go a little bit earlier with windy. So, BOB, what can we glean to answer our question how strong it is and compare all the different forecasts? I think it's safe to say at minimum we'll have 12 knots in the morning, and that's going to increase 20 to 30 knots. And also with gusts of up to 35 knots. Yikes. Predominantly, it looks like west moving to northwest is the direction we can expect. And given just the chart and our knowledge of Rodeo Beach and what we see It's pretty exposed beach um, with little wind protection. And it's actually in a valley, and it's a little bit of a wind tunnel in that valley. It's just off from the beach. And if we were to paddle there, we could expect not only the swell prediction, but on top of that, 5 to 6 foot wind waves. And as we mentioned, it's going to increasingly intensify and become more northwest. So with that in mind, would you go paddling today from Rodeo Beach? Oh, I have to admit, I crossed the bridge this morning by bike with my partner Julian, and we went for a ride to Rodeo Beach. And woof, it was rough. It was almost too windy to ride a bike, I'll say that. And it looked really chaotic. I took a video that I'll show to you guys at the end of this presentation. But I also want to honor that this is a personal choice, and we'll go into a little bit more about situations in which you may want to seek the wind, and situations where you may want to avoid the wind. All right. So we looked at how to forecast and how to essentially know before you go. But let's say you get there, you're standing at the put-in, you're looking at the beach, trying to decide what's going on, what am I seeing, how does this compare with what I expected, and how does this inform my decision to actually paddle or where I'm gonna go once I do put on the water. So in the early 1800s, there was this British admiral, and also he's a hydrographer, like a proto-oceanographer for the British Royal Navy, and his name was Francis Beaufort, Admiral Francis Beaufort, and he created this scale called the Beaufort scale, and it's used by a lot of ships today. So think larger vessels that are constantly going maybe a mile to 20 miles offshore, but also inland. So it's a helpful way to compare what we're seeing to something measurable. And something to keep in mind is that we're kayakers that typically don't tend to go more than a mile offshore. And we're also pretty small craft. So keep in mind that this was designed for someone sitting on a sailing vessel, most likely. But it's still really informative for us. All right, so I think it's super helpful to dive into the most common sea states that we see as kayakers, just to begin familiarizing. So I skipped over zero. Zero is pretty easy to conjure. It's just glassy, beautiful water that you get, from those mornings where you put on at 6 a.m. when there's very little wind, and your boat causes these ripples as you move through the water, and it's very zen. That's force 0. And as you move to force 1 on the Beaufort scale, you're gonna see a little more texture, but not a lot. It's not like you're whipping egg whites and it's like whipped up. It's just a little ripples. You can infer 1 to 3 knots of wind, and that's about 1 to 3 miles an hour. But you're not really gonna have any waves generated. And you're really not going to be able to, like, the flags that are around aren't going to be blowing full mast. They're just going to be kind of like hopping a little bit. So this is a nice zone, nice force to paddle in. We're moving up to force 2. This is when we're starting to get a little more texture. We're starting to see, I love the phrase that is used in the Beaufort scale, wavelets. I think I want to be a wavelet for Halloween. It's so cute. That's where we're not really getting a lot of wind enough to create white caps, but we are getting something that's gonna like noticeably make us do a few more strokes on one side versus the other. And you're not gonna get any real discernible waves. It'll probably be under a foot if you are getting any generated waves. And when you see this, you can pretty much infer it's around 4 to 6 knots of wind. All right. Okay, now we're on to force 3. It's getting a little more textured, we're reaching breeze category. We're dealing with 7 to 10 knots, which is around 8 to 12 miles per hour. We're getting large wavelets, so less cute wavelets. And then you'll start to see that there's a discernible peak or crest to these waves, where it's less just texturized water and more like discernible wind waves. And that's when it can get up to 1 to 2 feet. You'll be able to see on the trees, if you're by land, that the trees and leaves will be rustling. So that is our force 3. Now we're moving up to force 4. Okay, so typically at around 10 knots, you'll get the appearance of white caps. And white caps are those crumbly little white water from the wind lifting up the water and kind of whipping it up. So usually that's the sign to me as a paddler that it's starting to escalate. And that's when it starts to get, if you're going into a headwind or if you have wind coming up your side, a beam wind, this is what I like to call the annoying phase. It's not enough to like be, a determiner for me, maybe for some people and in certain crafts, but it's definitely noticeable. It's creating waves, it's creating white caps. It's starting to, like, if you were to stop paddling, you lose ground. This is what you experience at around 11 to 16 knots. And 16 is on the upper end of this. And I know 18 miles an hour is also on the upper end of this. So just remember, one of my favorite rules of thumb is that it's around 10 knots that you have the appearance of white caps. So if you're trying to make a bet with a friend looking at the ocean, say like, what do you think the wind speed is? And you see white caps, it's probably over 10 knots. Usually you don't see a lot of white caps being formed under 10 knots unless there's a strong current opposing the wind. So that's how you can hopefully earn some more money by winning bets using this system. All right, Beaufort scale, force 5. This is where for small craft and kayaks, it gets really dicey. At this level, you have multiple white caps. They're not just wavelets. Sir Beaufort categorized these as waves. You get the spray coming off the waves. You can expect 6 to 7 foot sometimes if you're far enough offshore. You can expect some like pretty hefty wind waves. And then the whole tree is starting to sway if you're by land. This is the upper threshold for comfortable kayaking. And not even this is, I'm not gonna sugarcoat, it's not even comfortable. This is definitely making you have to work. And then force 6, they call it a strong breeze, but for kayakers, this is full on wind. This is treadmill. If you're going into a headwind, this is definitely where you are like, I cannot miss a stroke and expect to keep making progress. This is 22 to 27 knots. You'll see that there are white caps, but then there are areas where there are less white caps because you have pretty drastic wind waves that are colliding, and these waves are creating more of like swell because the wind is so strong. This is what it's looking like right now at Rodeo Beach. It's pretty intense. And then you even have force 7. And this is for me where personally, if I'm fighting the wind or have a beam wind, it's just not worth it. This is 28 to 33 knots. This is a lot of spray, a lot of wind. The Coast Guard usually will put out a small craft advisory around this whenever it exceeds 20 knots consistently. And you just see, it just looks like a chaotic mess. And they're calling this gale, hence the gale force warning that you will often see and hear from. So just to also cover it, force 8, it goes all the way up to 12. This is really intense. You're seeing pretty big, powerful waves generated from wind of 34 to 40 knots. We're like on our way to tropical depression, if you're familiar with how hurricanes are measured. And this is where, it's a pretty drastic storm. you probably don't even want to be outside, let alone in a kayak. And this isn't really hopefully applicable to us, but I also wanted to mention just that the intensity that this scale reaches, which goes next to a strong gale, maxing out at 54-mile-per-hour winds, storm, even higher at 10, 11, a violent storm, 72 miles an hour, and of course that 75-mile-per-hour threshold jumps it up to a hurricane. And I really don't want anyone paddling in a hurricane. Okay, so how much wind is too much wind? The classic question. And especially thinking, okay, as a headwind or taking it from the side or quartering, and we'll go into what this means, how much is too much? And a lot of people will try and give you a hard, fast rule, but I try and shy away from that because not only do I think paddling the wind has a lot of usefulness at certain levels for really fine-tuning your technique for your forward stroke and other strokes, but I also think downwind paddling and learning how to link waves and surf as you're paddling is a very essential and fun skill, and just a great experience. So it depends on how much you want to suffer, but also it depends on what you're going after. Okay, so I created this based on a survey of my own resources and also combined it with my own experience paddling. And I know that this is a very personal thing to think of, like, what do you, because for some people it could be, I don't want any wind at all. And for some people, they really want to push it, white knuckle it through the wind. So this will give you a little bit of a rule of thumb also for what to expect for if you're fighting the wind, what kind of handicap you're dealing with speed. So at 5 to 7 knots or 4 to 7 miles per hour, this is when we start to notice, again, that annoying threshold where, especially if you have wind coming from behind and like throwing your stern or your bow around, this is where a lot of kayaks, especially the shorter performance kayaks, will start to feel a little bit of weathercocking. And we'll go into that term and what creates it a little bit. Moving to the right, we've got 7 to 10 knots, which accounts for 8 to 12 mile per hour winds. This is when you also get more wind generated waves. So not only are you having to mitigate the effect of the wind, but oftentimes you're maneuvering and either following seas or ahead or waves coming directly at you or from the side. And it's a hard thing to say, like a multiplier or some formula that you can apply to how much slower a certain increment increase in wind will make you and your speed. But from what I've experienced and what I trust, you can probably infer that you'll drop your speed by a third. So if you're paddling into a headwind at 10 knots and you're typically paddling 3 knots and sustaining that, you can expect to lose a knot. So keep that in mind. Of course, the reason why it's hard to give a formula is every boat is different, every body in every boat is different, and sometimes you may have a fully loaded boat, an empty boat, so there's so many variables, but typically knowing what you can make good on and then comparing that with what you see you can expect to lose some speed there up to a third. Then you move to 11 to 15 knots. That's 13 to 18 miles per hour. The waves get bigger. You're probably going to be doing some more bracing in these conditions, depending on where the waves are coming from. So you need to have those skills. This is a little bit more intermediate advanced. And if you're paddling directly into the wind, often you can experience your speed decrease by half. Again, this is just anecdotal and also just an easy rule of thumb, back of the napkin. By no means is this like mathematically sound. It's just a way to think about it and conceptualize it as you're planning your day. So I would start to warn you if you're going out in the afternoon and you already have 11 to 15 knots predicted. In places like the Bay Area in the summertime, this is often easily exceeded, forecast or exceeded. So that's another reason why I mentioned this is more advanced, because often you're caught in windier and gustier conditions than expected at this level. And then at 17 knots or 20 miles per hour, this is where it gets really spicy, to borrow a term from Melissa. You have to really be on your toes. You have to really fight. You have to have super tone technique. You have to be using some light navigational tools, some dead reckoning, perhaps some natural ranges to just make sure you're paddling where you want to be paddling and safely. If you want to go out in these conditions, either 11, 15 knots or 17 knots, and do a downwinder where you're basically surfing with the wind at your back, it's incredibly fun. But I highly recommend having the right boat for that, something that's longer, that has a rudder or a skeg. And also being able to surf and have those surfing skills at play. So there's a little bit of a suffering spectrum. Again, I want to honor the fact that one person's suffering is another person's playground. Or to say one person's battleground is another person's playground. So, and it also can depend on how you're paddling into the wind. A 17-knot headwind could be struggle, whereas in suffering, hence the battleground, whereas a 17-knot tailwind could just be someone's playground and a super fun day where you cover a lot of mileage in 2 hours. So this is just a start. And again, to break down a few of those terms we mentioned, just to orient how the wind is hitting our craft. We've got wind coming directly at us, directly at your bow. That's a headwind. And these terms that we use as kayakers are a fusion of nautical terminology and aeronautical terminology. So headwind, something that you would probably hear on an airplane. And then you've got bow wind. So that's typically wind that's not directly coming at you, but coming off the angle towards your bow. It's not coming from behind you, but it's not coming directly in front of you. I find this kind of wind very annoying. Then there's a beam wind coming directly at your side or somewhere off your side. It's also called a crosswind. Then if it's coming from behind you at an angle, at a diagonal, it's usually called quartering wind or quartering seas. Also super annoying. And following seas coming directly behind you, or a tailwind. Not annoying, especially if you know how to deal with it. I should also say that all of these can be annoying or not annoying depending on how you take them, your attitude, how you mitigate them with your technique and what tools you have. And then there's upwind. So let's say our imaginary wind cloud here, it's blowing from the bow, right? A little bit of a bow wind angle. That left side would be upwind, that left bow, and then downwind would be the other side, the right side of the kayak. So if you're in a rescue situation and someone mentions, oh, like take a stroke downwind, or let's go ahead and move the swimmer to the downwind side or upwind side, you'll know what that reference is. All right, let's take paddling into a headwind. So how to do it. Sometimes there's this masochistic side of me that enjoys paddling directly into a headwind. And what helped me make the shift mentally was being on this trip an extended trip where all we got was headwind, a fully loaded boat. It was hard to make progress. We had to make progress to get to our planned campsites for each day. And so I just thought, okay, how can this be a master class today in the best forward stroke technique possible? How can I make sure I'm really submerging that blade? I'm really making sure I'm not wasting any ounce of energy taking it out. I'm keeping my cadence at a fast pace, but also not an unreasonable pace that I can't sustain, so that I'm minimizing having to fight the wind. Is my feathering of my blade efficient given the speed and the direction of the wind? These are all considerations you can take into account when tightening your technique paddling into the wind. And this is something I actually recommend for some paddlers. I have some friends who are like, no, I hate paddling into the wind. I'm not going to do it. But I think you can gain so much technique-wise, especially forward technique, by paddling into the headwind. And a big shout out to Anna Wagner earlier. I believe it was in early May. It was one of the first Cali Collective coaching virtual sessions, and it's whitewater forward stroke, but I feel like especially paddling into the wind and having a more aggressive stance or sitting position and being able to make efficient catch and efficient use of each stroke, I highly recommend watching that because I gleaned a lot from that myself. You want to maintain your momentum. Something that really helps me is to sing to myself, and I use that rhythm to make sure that I have a sustainable momentum, a sustainable rhythm to my paddle stroke. And if you can refrain from taking breaks, that's why if you have to slow your cadence, that's okay. But definitely find something that's sustainable so you aren't tempted to take a lot of breaks, because that's where you can lose a lot of ground. Sometimes you're in an area where there's gust. You can break that cadence to take advantage of a lull between gusts if you're in a really, really windy situation. So keep in mind there's kind of on and off when it comes to max wind and in certain conditions as well. So those are some pro tips for paddling into a headwind. And a lot of times I should add, you're paddling directly into the waves and you're directly into the wind. And most sea kayaks are designed. They're not designed, but they just the happenstance or one of the effects of that design is that they really enjoy and are efficient paddling into the wind, and you get a lot of stability from it. Hence why if you need to use a skeg or a rudder, you definitely can, but oftentimes I find that I don't need to paddling directly into a headwind. All right, paddling with a tailwind. This is awesome. I can share this video with you guys in the slideshow, but it's an awesome example of two really talented surf ski paddlers. A surf ski is a super long kayak that you sit on top and have a rudder system, and they are very tippy and narrow, and they surf swell really well. But our sea kayaks, especially sea kayaks that are 16 foot plus, can surf swell really well as also. And if you're building speed and maintaining speed and really making sure that you're managing your trim, you can surf easily and do what they call link waves. So if you have a tailwind that's consistently creating waves, you almost want to plan, okay, I see, there's this consistency. If I can maintain the speed, usually after you start catching one wave, that wave propels you at the speed that most waves are moving, and it becomes a little bit of a virtuous cycle. So you're easily able to catch the next one and the next one. You maintain less and less exertion, and it becomes very fluid. And it can also like sometimes feel like you're dancing a little bit while you're paddling with the waves, and it's a really exhilarating feeling. You sometimes will need to make sure that you're not wasting energy by climbing to crest a wave, but instead taking advantage of that oncoming or that wave that's about to come behind you. Just like regular surfing and surfing at a beach, if you're surfing downwind and wind waves, you'll often want to use a rudder, so you can easily take a forward stroke into a stern rudder stroke with a lot of really beautiful, good torso rotation to make sure you're staying on line and tracking as you're surfing that wave. You need to make corrections. Make sure you're doing your corrective strokes when your boat is at the crest of a wave or on top of a wave. So your stern and your bow are free to move really quickly and efficiently, rather than in a trough where you're just wasting energy trying to overcome the weight of water that's around your bow and your stern. Usually, I don't like to take my sea kayak on a downwinder where I'm consistently bearing nose. But if you do catch a steep wave and your nose starts bearing, you can always lean back a little bit to slow down and lift your bow. And if you are getting surfed and you don't want to be surfed, you can always back paddle to maintain control. And I often will use a skeg or a rudder, and we'll talk a little bit more later on about how to best use a skeg and a rudder in windy conditions with different wind directions. But unlike a headwind, I will often put the skeg down to get a little bit of an extra boost, so I can more easily focus on maintaining speed to link waves, and I'm less focused on corrective strokes to make sure that I'm perpendicular to the waves on my back. All right. So this is definitely, this photo here really I can empathize with. I've had these moments, especially in certain boats. Quartering seas, beam, and bow seas. So this is where you're probably noticing at winds of around 5 to 10 knots, you're having to do sweeps on that windward side, the side where the wind is coming. You're also probably having to take extra strokes on that side. So you'll do a 3-to-1 or a 2-to-1 ratio of 2 strokes on one side and 1 stroke on the other, making these really deep and the other ones just maintaining momentum. A lot of folks don't realize that, especially for boats, a lot of popular sea kayaks these days that have a lot of rocker. Rocker being kind of like the half moon shape of the bow. I have a boat behind me to show you this. And I also have this resistance band, kind of show you to represent wind here. So the wind's coming this way. And this boat has a good amount of play. I'm gonna do that. So you see that there's a good amount of rocker. And as the wind's coming from my right side here, I'm edging. Oh, I'm always humbled by like edging on land. I'm consistently holding that edge and loading my weight up on my right butt cheek to easily sustain that edge. And that locks, it changes the water line of the boat and locks it in. So you're having to deploy less corrective strokes. And it's super helpful, especially if you're going from like island hopping and then there's only wind for a certain amount and you don't really want to have to contend with putting your skeg down or putting a rudder down. But it's enough to warrant just a slight edge into the wind. And oftentimes if there are wind waves associated with that beam wave, you're wanting to edge into the wave anyway, so it gives you that added stability. And if you're maintaining a forward stroke, of already being ready for that wave to come. So again, it looks like a lame edge, but my upper body's doing the work. But again, I'm thinking more about loading my weight and transferring my weight onto that butt cheek that's on the windward side, more so than lifting that. I find that if you're using this technique in windy conditions for a prolonged amount of time, too much of a focus on the opposing knee to maintain holding that edge can wear me out faster than just thinking about transferring my weight. So again, totally okay to use a rudder in this condition. If you have a skeg, that's okay too. A rudder system will literally be almost like a blade or a mini heel that flips down on the back of the boat, and you can usually steer directionally with it, whereas a skeg just comes down at the back, and I'll show you the skeg on this boat as well. And you can control how much of that skeg goes into the water. So the reason why quartering seas, beam, and bow seas are so annoying is because of weather cocking and oftentimes lee cocking. So I'm going to change, well, can folks still see me okay? I'm going to, if you can focus on my screen and less the slide, that would be great. I'm gonna use the boat to describe what's happening with weathercocking. All right, so if you have wind, let's say we've got a tailwind or a headwind coming from the bow, right, the front of the boat, and it's wisping down alongside the kayak here. And it's really less about just the wind turning the boat as it is the wind taking advantage of differences in water pressure as your boat moves through the water. So as we have forward momentum, we have more pressure buildup on the bow of the boat alongside this bow. A laminar flow that's created, right? And that forward momentum almost like anchors the bow without water pressure, right? So if the wind is coming from the headwind or from a quartering direction, or a quartering direction or a bow wind, right? It's gonna be hard given how this is cemented in the water to turn it. But if you keep on coming down towards the stern, there's almost like a little eddy caused around the stern area where the flow dissipates from the movement of your boat through the water. And the wind almost takes advantage of the lack of water pressure around your stern. So think of the wind as like an opportunist, being like, oh, here's something that I can push. And it can push your stern around, but it can't push around your bow because of the water pressure that's built up around that bow. So what to do, right? Let's say you've already been edging into the wind. You're ready for the big guns. You're ready for something else. I'm gonna move my screen a little bit here. You're ready to deploy your skeg. Okay. Boom. So here is a skeg. You guys see it? Oh, there it is. And this, by deploying your skeg, it releases this blade like a fin almost into the water. And the surface area of this causes its own laminar flow, and then it gives the stern much needed water pressure to anchor this as well, okay? But there's also something that happens called lee cocking, which is the opposite. And if anyone has over deployed their stern to the point where the water pressure from the depth of their skeg is more than the water pressure that's contending at the bow, that sometimes you'll notice the stern wants to go into the wind rather than the bow. So that's something to be mindful of. But weathercocking, it's less intuitive than you would think. Thanks for being with me while I scrambled around this kayak. All right, deploying your skeg. So think of the skeg as like a dimmer switch, right? So if you have it all the way deployed like it is now, you guys see, oh, there's like weird shadows. I apologize. So it's all the way deployed. That's gonna be a lot. And let's say the wind isn't that intense, right? And based on the direction and the intensity will determine how much you wanna deploy it. So kind of experiment with it, especially if you're in a different boat or a new boat. By the tailwind or a quartering wind or bow seas. See what difference it makes, okay? Because maybe you want just a little bit. Right? a little bit goes a long way when it comes to a skeg. Just remember that. So what I also want to caution people with is not to go ahead and as soon as it gets windy, be like, oh, put my skeg down, oh, put my rudder down. There's a lot of usefulness to learning how to paddle without a skeg and a rudder using really technical and beautiful corrective strokes, sweeps, edging, forward strokes. So don't let over-relying on a skeg or a rudder get in between you and furthering your paddling, especially when it comes to furthering your technique. Because the wind can be a really great tool, kind of like a resistance band for strength training. So that's one way. Another thing to mention on the note of weathercocking and lee cocking, if you have weight in your boat, it may be worth doing just a quick overview or analysis of like maybe my bow is too heavy and that's really causing more weathercocking, especially if you're notice weathercocking in lighter than usual winds than you would expect. It's probably a time to assess whether or not you have too much weight in your bow. And if you notice the opposite, if you notice lee cocking where your stern is trying to turn into the wind, maybe you have too much weight in your stern. So maybe instead of putting all of your water for your 3-day trip in your stern, move it, in your cockpit or to your bow. Redistribute it. So weight, think of it as ballast, kind of like ballast in a larger craft or a boat. Can also have a big difference in weathercocking and lee cocking and can be pretty effective if you're thinking about alternatives to a skeg even, or just ways to get around those two factors. Something I also want to mention is navigating in wind. Not only when you're reading your forecast, reading them alongside a chart for where you want to paddle, right? But another key tool if you're navigating in the wind is understanding how to use natural ranges. And for folks who don't know, a natural range, think of 2 points that are aligned, that can be aligned with each other to give you a sense of whether or not you're drifting, right? So let's say you're doing a crossing of between islands where the wind is really intense funneling through those 2 islands, and you found like one tree up higher on that island in front of you than another tree, and you want to keep those trees aligned to make sure the wind isn't pushing you too far off course, right? Because if the wind is pushing you too far off course, they'll start to deviate. If you're overcorrecting, they'll deviate the other way, right? So that's a quick and dirty way to kind of see how much the wind that you're combating or taking from your side or a headwind is throwing you off course. I really, really recommend paddling with a GPS watch. For the last few years, I've been paddling with one that is multi-sport, designed for triathlons, and I really like knowing my speed and just having an idea of how much speed I can maintain in different wind speeds and with different wind speeds and wind directions. So just kind of building my own self-knowledge and my own skill set. And it also helps to know, like, if you need to be at a certain place by sundown or at a certain time, how much you're losing, how much speed you're losing with the wind you're contending. So I recommend that. If you were to take a more advanced navigation class, they'll make you do math around speed made good and all of these things. And then there's, the caveat of it may not be accurate because you're, at the end of the day, it's like there's a level of perception. And so I just say, hey, get a GPS watch, build that knowledge. It's a lot more accurate and it'll accelerate your learning more than retroactively doing a speed made good calculation. Rescues in the wind. So what I want to emphasize with rescues in the wind kind of Titanic, where Rose is like, Jack, I'll never let go, right? Think about your gear and your boat as if you're the swimmer or if you're the person being rescued, as you never want to let go, especially of that boat, right? Because the number one complicating factor in a rescue where there's lots of wind is the boat going way far away from the swimmer. Like, too many times I've seen someone swimming maybe half a mile away from their boat, and their boat's just like out to sea under the bridge, and it just becomes a lot more exposure to manage. So that's why number one rule of thumb, never let go. If you're a swimmer, be proactive, hold on to your gear in the wind especially. If you're rescuing, the same principle applies, never let go. If you're performing a T-rescue, once you have a hold of that boat, let's say, okay, I didn't get to the bow where I want to be to begin my rescue. That doesn't mean let go and then paddle over. Work and practice on navigating the boat and spinning it around so you can begin your rescue without ever having to let go. That's a skill unto itself, right? And also learning how to maneuver yourself in a way where the person who is swimming isn't getting pushed between the two boats, because the wind swinging the boat, the empty boat that's now up and able to catch the surface area, catches more wind influence. So always being mindful of having the swimmer be upwind of you, ideally. Okay? I like, in a super, super windy environment, I like to have the swimmer hugging my bow, right? Up and out of the water where I can see them at all times. If anything were to swing around, I know where they are. If I needed to swim for any reason, I had to let go of their boat and I had to get back to it, I could still paddle with them there. All right. So the number one rule of rescues and wind, never let go. So I wanted to, since we looked at the forecast for Rodeo Beach, I wanted to share with you what it actually looked like at Rodeo Beach and get your interpretations of whether or not it measured up to the forecast. So here's just a quick view of what it looked like.
You see the little seal there in the waves?
Oh yeah, he beasted. All right, so quite spicy. I'd love to hear what you guys think that is, having a quick overview of the Beaufort scale. I went home and immediately looked to see what was the prediction or what was real-time measurement. But I don't want to give it away. So yeah, so I also want to let you guys know that was probably 17 to 20 knots. That probably would have been on the scale probably around a 4 or 5. So cool. Well, that concludes a lot of what I wanted to discuss. Thank you guys for hanging in there for a whole hour, and I'm really excited to answer any questions you have.
Thanks so much, Laura. That was awesome. After tides and currents, I was like, wow, my brain is just like so full of amazing knowledge right now. So, and now with wind, and I can't wait till the next one that you do. But anyways, so we're gonna start our Q&A, and we are gonna begin with Marianne King, who has a couple questions for you. So Marianne, feel free to ask, both of those questions in a row, and you are on.
Thanks, Laura. Here's my video. Hi, good to see you. Thank you. I was wondering if you ever change your paddle angle when you have a headwind, like you're feathering? And then second question is I often end up dehydrated because I like refuse to drink water because I don't want to stop making forward progress. So do you have any tips for kind of like managing oneself while not losing momentum?
Yeah, those are both great questions. I've played around personally a little bit with the blade feathering and blade angle. And what I've noticed is it really depends on the wind direction. And I typically paddle with a 30-degree feather. I know you have a pretty extreme feather from water polo, but every now and then I'll go up to a 45 because sometimes I do feel like having a little bit more of an offset allows that blade to slice through the air here, but it's pretty marginal difference for me. And then if I go even more extreme to like say like 60, that's the point where, you know, I notice even more of that slicing, but it can almost, depending on where the wind is coming from, cause the reverse effect. So I typically, to be honest with you, unless it's like a long distance with prolonged winds that I'm expecting, I won't mess with it. I'll stick with 30. If I'm paddling for a long distance with the same wind direction, maybe I'll make it more extreme up to like 45. But as I make it more extreme, and if the wind is really intense, I like to have it in a angle that I'm comfortable with in case I need to roll or brace. I'm more comfortable at 30 when I'm doing all of those maneuvers. So, and for the hydration, that's a really great question. And that's a big reason why I got a wearable hydration bladder. I have this, I like Kokatat PFDs, I wear Kokatat PFD, and they make a hydration bladder. I think it's called, Melissa, you may remember the name of it. It's like a water flow tributary. It's a tributary. And you just put, electrolyte water, anything you want. It holds up to around like 2 liters, and I find it super convenient. I usually just keep it wrapped around my PFD in a way where I don't even have to like bring it to my mouth. I can just go whoop, and then keep going. So, you've probably seen me use it. Highly recommended.
Cool. Thanks, Laura.
Marianne.
Thanks, Marianne. All right, who do we have next? Gail. All right, let's get you unmuted and you are up. Are you with us, Gail? All right. I'm going to read Gail's question. What suggestions? Oh, her mic just died. What suggestions if you're in a group and you're towing a fellow paddler in the wind?
Yeah. So I don't like to tow unless it's absolutely necessary. I think if you have a line out, a tow line out, and any combination of wind, waves, swell, you compound the consequence. If you have any sort of issue while that person's under tow, or if you as a tower have any issues. So there are some strategies you can use to help someone who's struggling in the wind in your group, almost as like a scale of escalation before you have to put a tow rope on them. So something I'll do is paddle next to that person. Psychologically, I think always being in the last, that person will slow down because there's almost this implicit embracing that I'm just slow and everyone's waiting for me. So if the person, it's almost like that idea of group management where you always want to go the pace of the slowest person. In the case that it doesn't slow you down in a dangerous way or you lose ground enough to stick with that person, I recommend it. Usually when you're paddling directly with somebody, neck and neck, you subconsciously match their cadence. So there have been times where I've been in a group where there's a slower paddler and I'll go up and start talking to them and paddle at the cadence that is not extreme, but something that I think they can do. And I'm often amazed at how they can match that cadence. It could be as simple next to them and saying like, hey, I noticed that you aren't edging into the wind. Maybe try that. Maybe put down your skeg. If you can, if it's a headwind or a situation where they could draft off of you and they understand how to hold position behind you, you could let that person draft behind you as you break the wind for them. Especially if you have a tandem in your group. Those tandems create a pretty big lead there. So there are definitely some ways to mitigate one person slowing down because they're struggling before putting a tow on. But if you do have to tow someone, as the person towing, I often will drop down my skeg because I'll have extra weight. So I want to not waste any energy with corrective strokes and having to do repetitive corrective strokes. So before I go ahead and bring them on board, I'll often drop a skeg first. And the skeg doesn't impede my turning ability, especially if I'm edging, but it'll definitely help me track while pulling extra weight. If even that becomes difficult, you can always do an inline tow where not only are you towing someone, but as long as it's safe enough and people have the right length of tow rope, dependent on the height of the waves, right? Because you don't want to be surfing back into each other or being yanked by too short of a tow rope if the trough to trough is really long. You can always have someone tow you, and you're doing this inline tow to maximize how much power you have if you're having the tower struggle to just tow one person. I've towed people in wind, and you sometimes really have to make sure the person you're towing remembers to not stop paddling. I think there's a tendency for especially beginners to think that it's a free ride, and there's never a free ride in kayaking. So make sure that they keep paddling while you're towing them. Those are my tips.
Those are great tips. There are no free rides in kayaking. That'll just become our company motto.
It's true. If you look at someone you're towing and they see you looking and they're like,
and then Gail has one more question. Any suggestions for paddling confused seas?
oh, yes. My number one suggestion is just to really make sure you're maintaining a forward stroke. And by also maintaining a forward stroke, you're having that balance with each blade submerged. It's kind of like a kickstand of balance, right? But also with your momentum, you're able to make more progress, regardless of the wave direction. So take advantage of a really beautiful forward stroke and also that momentum to give you stability. And just like they say in whitewater and in sea kayaking, the best brace is a forward stroke.
So true. I heard that really early on in my paddling career. And I remember someone saying to me, just remember, speed is your best brace.
Yeah. It's so
true. Awesome. Well, I think that probably wraps up our questions for this afternoon. So if Laura, if you just have a few closing comments or anything else you'd like to tell our folks out in the audience today?
Yeah, I really want to thank you guys. I know that it's a beautiful day and we're able to recreate more. So I'm definitely touched that you all shared your time this afternoon with me. And I also want to emphasize that, paddling in the wind, like paddling in the waves in the surf zone, it's something to be approached as a tool, not necessarily something to avoid. So again, think of it as almost like a resistance band to hone aspects of your paddling and do it safely. And I also want to add that, I am super excited to start paddling with you all in person. So we made it over the hump. for now. Woo!
Hooray. I know. Well, thank you so much, Laura. It's so awesome to see your smiling face and hear all of your awesome tips and techniques. And and I just have to say this, if you have not taken a class with Laura, I highly recommend it. You will glean so much in, a day or two or however many you want to spend with her. Definitely, I would say, jump into any of our classes, whether it's sea kayaking or whitewater. But anyways, thank you all for attending. And, this has been a really cool series for us, coming out of a bit of adversity and not exactly having the winter and spring that we had foreseen due to this virus thing. But this series has been really fun. We've had some pretty incredible coaches and paddlers on from all different backgrounds, experience. It's been incredible, and it turned into more than I could have ever hoped or dreamed for in this series. It was just a concept that we were talking about a few months ago, and it's blossomed into this beautiful series. So we have a couple more left. On the 9th, we have Natalie Kramer-Anderson. She is coming back with Kayaking and Pregnancy Part 2, and she's going to discuss postpartum paddling for those of you out there that are interested in that realm of family planning and figuring out how to get out there and have fun. And then next Sunday, so a week from today on the 14th, we have Darcy Getcher coming back, and she is going to be talking about her book, Amazon Woman. And if you don't know Darcy or don't know her book, look it up online. She did a source to sea expedition of the entire length of the Amazon River. So she's going to come on, she's going to talk about that expedition. Definitely not to be missed. And just as a side note, that is going to be our last webinar in this series. We are going to continue it. We're going to reevaluate as we kind of get into our seasons and are allowed back on the water teaching. But we do want to keep it going. We have an incredible amount of coaches and instructors with such an array of topics, from technique to mental strategies to the seas and more navigation. And we're going to drag Laura back on for more geeking out on some cool stuff. But thank you all for being here again. You will receive a link with access to this webinar. With all the wind that we are having, my internet is utterly terrible. So it may take a few days. If you don't see it in the next day or so, just give me a second, it will be there. And if you know of anyone that missed it today, you can find all of our archives on our shop page on our website. They're $5, totally worth it. Sales go to support the coaches of these events. And but anyways, that's all for me for now. Thank you again, Laura. You're amazing. Get out there, take a class, do some paddling, have some fun. But be safe, and we'll see you all soon.